Carson, Leno, Fallon. Now, it's Wine Talks with Paul K.
Hey, welcome to Wine Talks with Paul K. And we are in studio today, about to have a conversation with Anne McHale, Master of Wine. Introductions in just a moment. Hey, have a listen to a show I just did with Gavin Sachs. Gavin Sachs is a PhD professor at Cornell University working on the food grade lining of cans for wine. So apparently Coca-Cola and Sprite and 7-Up don't erode the food grade lining, but wine does. And so his job is to find some new materials to line the cans so you can drink your favorite Lafite Rothschild out of a can. Hey, a wine club subscription makes a great and impressive gift during the holidays for all the wine lovers on your list. You'll be the hero with a subscription to the Gold Medal Wine Club, featuring hand-picked selections that please the beginning wine enthusiast to the most discriminating connoisseur. Visit goldmedalwine.com to join or send a tasteful gift. And use the promo code PAULK, P-A-U-L-K, and you'll get 10% off your first order. But we're going to have a conversation today all the way out in, where are you, Anne?
London.
In London town. Have a conversation about wine with the Master of Wine. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Paul. It's an absolute pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Well, I appreciate that. Very nice. And in this, we were just talking off camera, this accent, I should have placed it, but I couldn't. But we're born in Northern Ireland.
That's right. Belfast, Northern Ireland.
Is there a difference in the accent between the South and the North?
Very much so, yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
Aficionados can spot it straight away. In fact, some people get my accent mixed up with a Scottish one because, a lot of Scottish people settled in Northern Ireland. So there is a lot of similarity there.
Are you interested in losing it?
Well, I've lived in London, in England, for 20 years now, and I haven't lost it, so probably not.
It's not happening soon, I guess.
Probably not happening yet.
My father came from Cairo in 1949, and I didn't know him then, obviously, but he had a very thick English accent, and with all I knew him with an American accent, all through and through, with a twinge of Middle East because he's from the Cairo. But I don't know how you do that actually. I guess you have to practice to try and
sometimes it's conscious, sometimes not. Interesting, isn't it?
But it's got to be, it's your heritage. So why, right? Let's everybody know that you're from Northern Ireland.
Absolutely. I've had to adapt certain vowel sounds so that English people can understand me better. But...
So you're in London, and you're a master of wine, and that's a very difficult degree. It's one of the great accolades in the wine industry, and it's very academic to do. What would motivate a woman from Belfast to be in the wine business and not in the Irish whiskey business?
That's a great question. So the story does go back quite a long way. So my father, who is not in the wine industry, but he is a great wine lover, in his late 20s, founded the first ever student wine society in Queen's University, Belfast. So that was in 1969. And I grew up with my parents always talking about wine. My dad used to talk about his days at the wine society. I didn't actually drink alcohol until I was 18, which is quite interesting because we came from quite a religious family where we took a pledge not to drink until 18. But as soon as I turned 18, I got into it with gusto. And I went to university in Cambridge in England. And because of my dad's stories about the Wine Society in Belfast, the first society that I went to join up to was the Wine Society. And so people often ask me if that meant I was on the varsity blind tasting team in the match against Oxford. But I actually didn't even know that existed. I used to just turn up to the weekly Wine Society meetings thinking that it was a very sophisticated and non-student-y way to drink alcohol. And so that was kind of where my grown-up relationship with wine began. Again, I didn't know that you could have a career out of it. I went to the Cambridge University careers office before I did my final exams, and I said, what will I do with my life? I have this degree in French and classics, and I don't know what to do. And they, suggested all the usual things: law, management, consultancy, teaching. And I basically said, no. And then at the end of my summer that year, I moved to London with a group of friends, got a flat share, and was living off, I don't know what you call it in the US, was living off my overdraft. It's essentially living on credit. And then 6 weeks later, I got a job in a wine company that wanted a French speaker to arrange. It was effectively an administrative role. We were importing French wines into the UK market. So there was a lot of admin to be done, liaising with the logistics people and the wineries in France, filling in the forms for HMRC, which is the customs organization in the UK. And it went from there. They sent me on my first WSET course, and I really got the bug at that point. Even though I'd always had this sort of love of wine from my childhood, from my youth, I really got my personal interest in studying the subject at that point. And from then, it just seemed kind of natural to continue to work my way through the different levels of wine qualifications. And I did hesitate a little before coming to the Master of Wine because I knew how daunting it was, how challenging it was going to be. But I wanted the challenge. I relished it. And I gained so much from those years of studying.
It's interesting. You just said a mouthful. So we're gonna peel it back just a little bit. We're gonna back the trolley up a minute. Because there's so many different avenues to go in. Now, I found that fascinating that you're, in Belfast and a Catholic girl, and you had to take a pledge not to drink until you're 18. I had a conversation yesterday with the head of the Alcohol Control Board of the state of Utah. And so they do, I don't know, $600 million in sales or something. And he's a Mormon. And in fact, learned Italian because he spent 2 years on his LDS missions trip in Italy. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. Here's a career that it's focused on what exactly, his background would resist.
Yeah.
This whole time, right? I mean, it's fascinating. And my son-in-law is an Anglican priest here in the United States.
Wow.
Yeah. And so he loves wine, and it's one of his favorite subjects to talk about. He's a very academic guy. But there's so many different avenues in the world of wine, academia being one of them. We're going to peel that back when we get to exactly what you do every day. But, work on the floor of a store, logistics, curating wines for a restaurant, being a somm, all the different things that come with it. There's something academic that was interesting to you that you pursued WSET and then the Master of Wine?
Yeah, I always had been quite academic, so it seemed natural to me to continue that route. And one of the careers, I mentioned the careers office and all the things that I had ticked off as no, definitely not. But the one that drew me the most was teaching. And I ended up deciding not to be a teacher in the traditional sense because I didn't want to stand in front of a room of teenagers who didn't want to be there to learn French and to try to force them into it, because I remembered what my own French classes had been like. But I was drawn to education. And so it seemed natural to, first of all, work my way up through the qualifications myself, and then to use that knowledge and experience somehow to be able to help others to learn about wine. And that is what ended up happening. So after 2 years working, I worked in the French wine company for a year and a half. Then I did a short period working in marketing for Wines of New Zealand. And then I joined Berry Brothers and Rudd in the education and events team. And it was there that I started to get my first experience of teaching about wine. So, I was drawn to that side of it.
It's an interesting thing. And I wrestle with this, particularly in fact, I just went to a place yesterday and I was talking to, it was actually a studio in Burbank, which is part of the Hollywood part of Los Angeles. And I was telling them about a show, and I'm going to send you my reel on the show I want to produce on wine. But it kind of goes after the idea that, wine's very academic, but so many people don't understand that part. And it's also part of the wine business that's a little intimidating. And so when you're teaching these things and you've been through it yourself, you're an academic person. In fact, I was going to say my dad, when he graduated from high school, because Cairo was a English protectorate, he has a certificate that allows him entrance into Cambridge or Oxford, automatic.
Wow.
And he didn't do it. He came to the United States and got his master's in pharmacology, but he kept that certificate. I said, can't we Photoshop it and put my name in there or something? Or, but that's a very academic school, obviously. And I wonder, when you're doing these teachings, that when the student comes to you, what are they looking for? What is a typical Anne McHale student looking to learn and do what with it?
It really depends on the level, So I used to teach beginners a lot. I still occasionally do. And those people who are very new to wine are looking for things like they want confidence when they're confronted with a restaurant wine list. They don't want to feel completely bewildered. And they want to be able to decipher the basics. They want to know why they like the wines that they do. They want to be able to describe them a little better, and they want to be able to match them successfully with food. They want to be able to decipher a label. So those are the types of things that I'll focus on with people who are new to wine. Then I also help students at various levels of the WSET trajectory and Master of Wine students as well. So with those students, it's more about how do we acquire the skills needed to pass the exams so that they can move to the next level. So I do a lot of that kind of work, both with people in the industry and with passionate wine lovers who are challenging themselves to take these WSET qualifications because it's such a love and a hobby for them.
That's an interesting thought. You just triggered a thought, because I told you my experience about applying for the Master of Wine, and then the answer, which is, the very specific way to answer these questions. How much of all this is purely the knowledge base of wine, the terroir, the soil, the grape varieties, the mechanics of making wine in different parts of the world, versus accommodating the format of a test like you would do in college entrance exam, possibly, or is it obviously as a combination of both, but passing the test for what? What do they want to do when they pass it? What did you want to do when you passed the test? Did you come out on the other side going, wow, this is great, now I've got my Master of Wine and I can sit here and pontificate on wine, or I got exactly what I wanted out of it?
It's really, really interesting that you raised that, Paul, because, exactly as you say, if you just focus on passing the test, you aren't going to emerge with as much knowledge and understanding as if, you had really worked your way through every aspect of the syllabus, regardless of the exam. Mm-hmm. But there is a balance to be struck. So to answer your first question, I would say that if you don't have an in-depth knowledge for something like WSET Diploma or Master of Wine, if you don't have an in-depth knowledge of all the aspects that you touched upon, terroir, the business of wine, all of that, you will not be able to pass the exams. But I think that too many people overemphasize the acquisition of knowledge when it comes to these types of exams, and they underestimate the importance of what I would call exam technique and study technique as well, because there are efficient ways of extracting the information that is out there into your own study notes, as well as efficient ways of learning that and applying it in the exam. Mm-hmm. And so people really, what I help people with is how to get better at consolidating that vast potential amount of knowledge and applying it in the exam format so that they can get that recognition and get that qualification. Because I've encountered so many people particularly at those two levels, diploma and MW, who are extremely intelligent, knowledgeable people. They're excellent blind wine tasters, but they haven't learned the skills of applying it in the way that the examiners want, in this format. And then they never get to show off so that they had that knowledge, because their friends will say, did you pass your exams? And they'll say no. And the friends will say, but how is that possible with everything that you know? Yeah, so I want to help people with that, to get past those barriers. And for myself, to answer your second question, I think I was a little bit unclear as to exactly how I would apply my MW qualification. I knew I wanted to achieve it. It was a real goal for me to kind of, scale that Everest. It's like a personal challenge. Well, what I ended up doing, I was still working at Berry Brothers and Rudd at the time that I passed, and they had very kindly sponsored me through the program. I ended up kind of moving into a more ambassadorial role for the company. I traveled to our offices in Hong Kong and Singapore, and I represented the company and used that expertise and that status, to share that knowledge more widely. And that suited me absolutely perfectly. And in a way, that is still what I do, just albeit from my own business.
I the number that was thrown out at me years ago was, I think the first time you take the exam as like an 8% of the people pass all the way through and get their degree. And then you can, and I don't remember the number, but let's enlighten the listeners. You can take the final exam in parts, and you can take it how many times before you sort of have to like regroup, and I guess you go back to like playing one of the chutes and ladders game as a kid. You gotta go back to the beginning.
Yeah, I'd have to double check what the rules are, but yeah, if you pass one part of the MW exam on the first attempt, then you've got X number of goes to pass the other part before you have to start from scratch again. I can't remember the exact number of
Something
attempts
like, okay.
and how many years, but
does that 8% sound accurate?
They don't really release statistics like this, partly because, there are so many different components to the exam. Some people are passing some of them, some people are passing all of them, some people are passing none of it. It's actually very hard to collate all of that. So they don't have exact statistics on how many people begin and then complete. So I'm not sure, to be honest, but I do know it is low. It's low.
Do you think that, let me see how I rephrase this. It's a passion. It's a question about the passion, because obviously this is a very difficult degree. Even just getting through regular, studies as a student when it goes to college takes, some goal setting and some passion to get through it. But I had young representatives in here, brand new. There's a lot of consolidation on the wholesale side in America, and so they're hiring kids from liquor stores, floors, and they came in, and this is my 35th year of every Tuesday, literally every Tuesday, tasting wine from 9 to 2. And so we've seen a lot of people, a lot of wines. And now it's required by most wholesale groups in America to have some kind of WSET degree, one, at least one, if not two. And so these two young men said, "Oh yeah, we're at level 2." I said, I don't really care. Because if you're only getting this degree because it's required to get a job, then you're missing the point of what this industry is about. And I gave him a little lecture, this old man giving these young kids a lecture on what their outlook should be with what we do here. And how much of this do you encounter where a student comes and like, well, I want to learn about wine. And, you talked about used to do beginners, but let's say you're doing that again. I want to learn about wine. All of a sudden I go, wow, I don't know. I don't really care. It's just, I thought I could learn it and be done with it. Did that happen much?
Where somebody is wanting just to learn it for the sake of it and doesn't have the passion.
Yeah, right. It just doesn't really, they don't realize what it is about. And it can be very academic, and there's so much to learn.
Yeah. Okay. I see what you're saying. Yeah. No, I definitely have had people come along when I was running the beginners courses at Berry Brothers, who came along because they thought it would be a sort of gentle, fun evening of drinking. Or they maybe did a 6-week course, again, because they thought they would be able to impress their friends at the restaurant with their wine knowledge. And then they realized that really they were only looking at the tip of the iceberg, and that in order to understand it better, they would have to sit with a book. And they found that a bit annoying and gave up on it. Yeah, so that has happened.
So do you think then the WSET, and I'm going to separate that from the Master of Wine because they're two completely different things, but the WSET, at least as an academic approach to wine, is a great place for a beginner to start to understand wine. And of course, you and I know that you need to taste and taste and taste and taste to understand what the books are saying, but is that a great source of academic path for understanding wine?
Yeah, I think the WSET courses are comprehensive, rigorous. And I don't even work for WSET, so I'm just genuinely saying this because they're really well tiered as well. So your level 1 is, let's say you work in a bar and you just need to really understand the basics about fermentation and which grapes are red and which are white. Brilliant course, 1-day course. Level 2 is the place where I recommend that most wine lovers, whether amateurs or industry, begin, because it's very comprehensive. You cover all the major grape varieties, where they're grown and what styles they produce, and you taste. And then, you go up to level 3, you learn more about production. Level 4, you go much more in depth into business and so on. And it's absolutely, they've got a great team of people working there. I know a lot of people who work at WSET, and they're all very bright and educated, and it's just very well organized as a series of qualifications. And I think a lack of knowledge really amongst careers offices, for instance, like my experience, that such a defined trajectory of sort of skills and qualifications exists within the wine industry.
It's part of my sizzle reel that I'm going to send you is sort of taking a pot shot at the aristocracy of wine. And I think you probably would agree that most people that don't understand wine, and then they hear you talking about it, you're swirling and you're sniffing and you're spitting and you're explaining the layers and you're going through the 3 components, and they're like, what are you talking about? And it sort of hit me that maybe we self-propagate this aristocracy. Maybe we separate it on purpose, not subconsciously through the years. And I was on the Austrian air flight the other day. We were on our way to Paris, and I thought, okay, I'm going to watch this thing. And it was a Klaus de Jong, which is a great master of class of wine. He does a very good job of cinematography, lots of slow motion drone shots, things like that. I couldn't get through it. It was about Gruner Veltliner, and it was beautiful set, beautiful lighting, sound was perfect, but subject content was absolutely excruciatingly difficult to get through. And I get it. I get it. I thought I'd learn something. And I thought, this is on an airline, which means the general public is going to try and see this. And if I'm general public, I'm like, forget it. This is not happening. Do you find that? Do you think, like, when people come to you, are they saying, wow, this is really hard. I don't believe you. I don't believe that you can taste leather, cedar, cigar box, and all the rest of it.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I think one of the reasons that people have enjoyed learning from me over the years is that I do help them to break down that kind of stuffy, elitist image. Maybe it's, being a woman. And when I started doing this, I was very young, so I wasn't the typical the image that people associated with the swilling and the sniffing and the swirling and the leather and cigar box and all of that. So I think there are 2 aspects. One is explaining to people that these words that people use about wine are not all fanciful. Some of them are, but a lot of the time, the chemical compound that's present in leather is present in the wine because of what's happened in the fermentation and the aging process, and explaining that to them so that they think, okay, well, with a little bit of palate training, I too could pick this up. And it's not that somebody's just making it up and trying to bamboozle me. And then the second thing is, having a laugh about it and say, what's the most bizarre word that you can come up with, to describe this, and just having fun with it. But people who come to me as beginners are usually very anxious that they pick up a glass of wine and I'm saying, oh, I can get all these citrus aromas and I can also get butterscotch. And they're saying, Anne, all I smell is white wine.
Yeah.
Please help. Please help. And so I think what I've been able to do successfully is convince people that that's normal. We are not born with the ability to put language to our sensory experiences, just as we are not born with the ability to speak a second language or play a musical instrument. These are skills that have to be acquired. I spent some time with my 8-year-old niece last weekend with the Nez du Vin kit, showing her the different aromas.
Wow.
But I wish someone had taught me how to assign language to smell and taste when I was that young, because you're like a sponge at that age. You'll pick up everything.
Absolutely.
So we had great fun. I was testing her over and over again on peach and raspberry and honey, and we had a lot of fun with it. So
it's a color wheel. What's the aroma wheel?
We didn't use the aroma wheel. We just did the little blind, smelling
Wow.
little bottles of scent. So Yeah.
Well, they have that kid, like the kid you're talking about. My father, when he was being a pharmacologist, plant-based medicine master. Now I remember when you triggered my thoughts, he had all these chemicals that were wine related, tartaric acid and citric acid. I still have some of the bottles with this hand typed label. And he was doing this in the 70s, teaching people those sensations that those will give you, because it's not just about flavors that you can describe, but it's the structure of the wine, the balance of the wine, the acids.
Yeah, that's very important as well, particularly if you are a student of wine.
The confidence take needed, and I suppose this is where your classrooms and your education is helping students have confidence in this, because a lot of people understand it. I'm around a lot of people that understand it, but to open your mouth and say something in a crowd is quite intimidating, even if you've been studying and reading, because you're not sure if you're going to be right, and that's really no right to it. I was invited to a lunch, and I thought, oh my God, this is going to be horrible. There's all these geeky guys. They drink Harlan for dinner, for lunch. There's these high-end drinkers. And it was rather educational for me. It was a lot of fun. It was like 6 of us. One person chooses a wine and pays for it all. And then they go through and they have fun with it, right? And they taste it. And it actually was a very fun event. But this guy had chosen a vertical of Grange. I mean, this is like $7,000 worth of wine the guy pours for the 6 of us. And he goes, I'm going to pour 2 white wines first. And now I've done this 35 years, but you still wonder sometimes if you really understand it or if you're good at it. And I don't really do a lot of blind testing. I should have all these years, but I didn't. So he poured these 2 white wines, and everybody's going around the table. I think it's a California Chard. The wines were older. We could tell that. And in my brain, unconsciously, I started calculatus eliminatus, from the Dr. Seuss, where I go, well, it's not California Chard. That's obvious. It's not from Spain. That's obvious. It's not from, the Caucasus. That's obvious. It's not Italian. That's obvious. I landed on the Rhone. And so out of nowhere, in front of these guys I've never met before, who do this every month, and they've been doing it for years, I said, this is a Marsanne-Roussanne blend. That's all I said. And the host didn't say anything. And everybody going around, and that's all I said, because I was intimidated by the group. I didn't know who they were, even though I've done this for a long time. And at the end, he goes, that was a Marsanne-Roussanne blend. And I thought, hey, you know what? I learned something along the way. and I thought it was really cool.
And
I kind of earned my stripes with these guys, but that's not easy to do. And you have to tell your students, you've got to taste, and you've got to taste, and you've got to taste, and you've got to taste. And then you got to decide when you're tasting whether this is just a bad version of what you're tasting, or it's a really good version, and you're starting to learn it. I mean, how does one do that? How does one get to taste as much as is necessary to do? There's a long story just to get to there, but
yeah, well, it's interesting what you're saying about, there are 2 different kind of ways of doing it. From what I understand, I don't know a lot about the master sommelier qualification, but I do know that they have to kind of nail their colors to the mast, don't they? Just, like, this is what this wine is. And that's pretty terrifying to think for me of doing that, because in the Master of Wine exam, it's much more, you get there via a circuitous, logical, written route. So if somewhere along the way you veer off on the wrong path, you'll get some credit for the bits that you were right about. So, for example, texturally, that wine may have been not so dissimilar to a California Chardonnay. So if you had concluded California Chardonnay, you may have picked up some points there for that element of it. You went off on the wrong path, perhaps with the acidity or the oak. And so that's a different way of doing it. So with my students, because I am teaching them to answer those more academic written exams, I am advising them what key wines to know really, really well, and what ones to taste perhaps a few examples of, but not exhaustively to taste everything, because It's just not possible to taste that number of wines. Obviously, it depends where in the world you're based. And, the reason that this qualification, the WSET and the Master of Wine kind of sprung up in London is that historically in this city, because we didn't produce a lot of wine of our own, we imported wine from all over the world. So we got to know the world's wines in a way that other places didn't. And still, I would say London is one of the key global cities where you can access pretty much any wine you want. So if you are based here, it's a great place to be if you're studying the world of wine. So that's why a lot of people still gravitate here. If you're outside a global city and there isn't such a range of wines available, then you do need to travel to somewhere where you can taste a range of wines. If you work in the industry, you do have the advantage of being invited to tastings and not having to fund it all yourself, but it's very challenging. And so there are strategic methods that I teach my students for how to make sure that you're equipped to answer the exam questions without having tasted all the world's wines, which is not possible.
Is that possible? I just had a thought about inspiration because, and you mentioned it, you touched on it earlier, that women in wine, of course, is a very big subject in today's environment, particularly in the United States. I'm sure it is in London as well. Is there resistance still to that? That's you're a woman and you're in this industry, and which has been a very patriarchal all these years, or is that smoothed over?
I personally haven't encountered any issues with that. I think it depends what space you're in. So I have heard from women who work in the fine wine sales world, which is very male dominated still. They've found that a little challenging. But in the education space, I would say there are just as many women as men, if not more in some places. So I haven't had a problem with that. And I think I probably benefited from being a sort of fresh voice at a time, at the time when I was still in my mid-20s, beginning in wine education and being different, from what people expected when they were learning about fine wine. But, the patriarchy's still there. So it's all going to take time.
I had a funny episode years ago, actually. Young Black woman, she makes wine from flowers. I've brought this up before in the show, but I can't remember her name now. Anyway, she makes wine from flowers in Oakland, California. And not only is that fascinating that she was able to pull that off, but she was able to get the Alcoholic Beverage Control Board in California to buy off on a 40-foot travel container, shipping container as a winery in a parking lot in some store. That was a feat in itself. But she said, I've encountered racism, sexism, and grape supremacy. Because I go, what a great term. I walk into a wine shop and I tell them I have wine from flowers, and they go, we don't sell wine from flowers, so that's the way it goes. You mentioned something about the early days of the MW and the people like Michael Broadbent, my good friend Bartholomew Broadbent, his son. And once in a while I would call Bartholomew and say, I've just read this story, or I just read this rating. And I thought of your father, because my dad knew Michael. He bought from him at the Hubline auctions back in the day. I go, but I don't think that they would have used this 100-point scale. He goes, no, my dad used a 5-point scale. And I've read Michael's book before, his tasting notes on different parts of Bordeaux, et cetera. And what do you think of this, the proliferation, there's a word, of scores, critics, techniques? I always stand by the fact that I could taste this incredible Etna Rosso, that's 95 points, but I also can taste a Cabernet from Napa that's 95 points, and they're dramatically different wines. Do you find people relying on points, and what do you think in general of the idea?
I would say that when the 100-point scale kind of burst onto the scene, it was really Robert Parker, wasn't it, who first kind of made it in the early 80s. And I would say that if you are from outside this kind of rarefied world that we exist in, and you haven't studied wine and done courses and all of that, it actually probably was very reassuring to people to see scores, because it was something that they could really understand and really get to grips with. And there's something to be said for that. There's something to be said for anything that is more inclusive and doesn't alienate people. But personally, of course, I completely agree with you that, you can't assign a number to a wine and have that tell anything like the full story of the wine. So I don't love scores,
Yeah.
I don't love scores, but I can see why critics use them, as long as people are encouraged to read what the critic has written alongside the score, see how they're conveying the essence of that wine through their language. I think that should be something that should be encouraged, rather than just looking at these numbers, which are kind of meaningless in that they are incredibly subjective and can also change very rapidly over time anyway. That would be my those are my thoughts on scores.
That's a good answer. I'm going to take a quick break and talk about my friends at Total Wine & More. Still looking for an amazing gift? Total Wine & More is one of my favorite places to shop for friends and family. With so many great bottles to choose from, I found gifts for everyone on my list, including a Cabernet for Sis, though she does like Spanish wines as well, and champagne for a coworker. How about a single barrel bourbon for your father? Most guides over there at Total Wine understand what you're looking for, so the lowest prices in over 30 years. You'll always find what you love and love what you find only at Total Wine & More. Spirits not sold in Virginia and North Carolina. Drink responsibly. B21. That just reminded me of something. There's something romantic, I think, about the wine world. I think it took me a long time, and like I just told you, I retired a few months ago after 35 years of curating wine, and it took me a little while into it for it not to be business, for me to learn to appreciate what this beverage is. How would you define this ethereal experience? Maybe it's not even possible to define it. This ethereal value of a glass of wine that I think every generation eventually figures out. Is that possible?
The more, not that I would say that you need to have knowledge to love wine, but that little bit extra understanding of the depths of experience that are behind a glass of wine can contribute to that ethereal experience that you get. So it's so interdisciplinary, isn't it? Wine, it sort of is intertwined with history and all the scientific disciplines and geography and philosophy and, social and cultural things as well. I mean, it's just so endlessly fascinating. And if you can convey even some of that to people, a little bit like, appreciating art or appreciating music, I think the depth of your experience will be richer. And so for me, that it's all of those layers that come together when I drink a glass of wine, and particularly if I have met the producer, been to the region, have some lovely association with, my husband from that vineyard. It all adds to the depth of experience. It's very hard to pinpoint one thing, isn't it, which contributes to that.
And I tend to think it's the humanity of it all, that certainly storytelling and the origin of the story enhances that experience with a glass of wine. And I think that's evidenced by somebody going on vacation and having a glass of, in a trattoria, an old-fashioned glass, some kind of, entry-level Italian wine, but thinking it's the best thing they've ever had because they're sitting in front of the Parthenon, looking at this amazing vista, and it all of a sudden it all clicks together. But there's more to it than that besides the experience. And it also comes to this question when I asked a lot of winemakers, and in fact, I just asked the CFO of Cheval Blanc the other day, like, what's the end game? What are we trying to do? I think all wine, properly made wine, and I think I go back to this thing I said earlier, that everybody, that eventually all generations, despite drinking White Claw, come around to have this glass of wine and go, wow, this is doing something for me besides the 14% alcohol. And I don't know if it's the fact that it's from the earth. It taps itself down to the most basic minerals that can come from the earth, and that reacts with our body and our mind. I have failed to define this value, but certainly I think you're right. The story, the experience, understanding where it's from. But then I always ask, like I said, what's your end game? What are we trying to do? If you're experimenting with different varietals in Bordeaux now, and you're trying different trellising, and you're trying different canopies, and we got climate change, is our job just to produce the best thing we can? What does that mean? The best expression of where it's from, or the best expression of the brand? And that was a tough question, because it's a balance, I think.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? When you were talking about people eventually coming to wine, at some point in their lives, I was just thinking about, in a way, we as humans do age the way a very fine wine does. We develop complex layers, and perhaps that, as we age, we have that framework, that depth, use again the depth of experience to understand wine in a way that we're not going to appreciate. I have laid down wine from the vintages of my two nieces, and I suspect that when they're 18 or 21, those wines will be completely wasted on them.
Yeah, it's possible.
Yeah, you need.
You're going to pick wisely, and this is your job. You better know what you're doing.
Or I could celebrate their 21st birthdays with the wine. Just don't give them.
Right. May want to look at a port for that.
Yeah.
It's something that is interesting, because the answer that the monsieur from Cheval Blanc told me was, that's a tough thing for us. We have to make sure that when you open this bottle, and somebody's spending $1,000 for a bottle of wine, that this is expressing who Cheval Blanc is and their philosophy on wine, but it also is to express what happened that year. And I think that's the part that's challenging for most novices, is like, what does that mean? What happened that year? So then you would move into the idea that, well, if that's all it is, if you really, the end game is just to produce exactly what that vintage is to produce for you, because it was given to you in the vineyard, then you'd have to be a biodynamic farmer, or at least organic, where the brand recognition is less important than the expression of the terroir. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's interesting about it expressing a moment in time. And I guess what you're saying is that in order to express that moment in time properly and from that terroir, it needs to have been nothing synthetic.
Nothing happened to it, right.
Is that kind of what you're saying? Yeah.
Well, I think so.
Yeah.
There's a Pio and Chenza's winery in Patagonia. I mean, that thing is radically different year to year. Purely biodynamic. We're not going to play with it. Completely palatable and gorgeous wines, but there's no brand expression that I can tell, at least the years I've tasted.
Mm-hmm.
And so does that frustrate you then, what you see in the supermarkets as not expressing anything but the center shelf of the supermarket? So in other words, whatever people need to have on their table, because I think you and I would agree that these brands are necessary to bring people to the table that otherwise don't drink wine, or at least are learning about wine. But you and I know they don't express really much of anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What was eye-opening for me when I was doing my MW studies and exploring these kinds of issues was the work of Dr. Steve Charters, MW. He has a book called Wine and Society, and he talks about really what we fail to do most of the time when we talk about wine is to subdivide it into two categories. There's wine, the product, which is the wine that is simply a commodity, a beverage. It is fermented grape juice that is enjoyed by people without much thought. And it's usually a branded product that people will recognize the brand and return to the ones they like the taste of. And then you have wine, the produce, which is an agricultural product from the land, if you like, and it expresses its place, it expresses its time. And those are two really quite distinct categories. Mm-hmm. So in any discussion like that, I think I find it helpful in my mind to separate those two things. And as you say, we need the product to bring people to the category. So I don't really have any objection to that. But if we want the other category to remain, to stay alive, then we need to bring people across to that as well. And that we have to somehow inspire those people with the passion and the excitement that can come from appreciating something from the land and from a time and a place. And, that's a job, an ongoing job that we have to do if we want to keep our industry alive.
All generations have had it. My father stopped in Napa in 1974 at Sutter Home, and there's this young man named Bob Trincaro pouring off this pink stuff that didn't have a label on it yet, and asking my dad's opinion. And then we had Bartles and James, spritzers, and they're always disguising wine with something. They're putting it in cans or Tetra Paks. And that part frustrates me because I think of this as a very romantic industry that has this very ethereal beverage. And so here's a really radical question that has gotten some really fun answers. We're almost out of time already. I can't believe it. And that is, what if profitability wasn't part of this equation? What would the winescape look like? And I'm going to refer to something real fast. When they were appellating Burgundy at some point, and I forgot what year it was and what appellation it was, but one of the winemakers said, we should put in our appellation rules that we're not allowed to advertise, because our job is to produce the best that we can produce. And if we do that, they'll come and buy the wines anyway. If we advertise, we're sort of cheapening the brand. Of course, it didn't fly, but kind of saying what I'm saying. What if profit? What would we produce if profitability wasn't part of it? Would it be different?
You may find that you're just kind of going back to these agricultural roots again, where some people veer off into making the highest possible quality product because they value the expression of the land, like the monks in Burgundy who drew out all the little micro delineations of the terroir. And then you would probably find some people who would produce, rustic red to chuck back with your steak. And it would be a beverage, but it wouldn't be maybe perhaps on the same cynical scale, I suppose you could say.
Right,
it would still be a product of the land, but it would be not what we might describe as a fine wine. I think both things would still exist, but just on a smaller scale.
That is you said something very important, actually. It's very frustrating because, the monks didn't know. They didn't have chemicals and copper sulfate and all the things that go into wine, and they figured out this micro differences in terroir, which is always an incredibly fascinating conversation to have about Burgundy. But now, then we produce all this crap, and post World War II, there's all the chemicals, and then now we're so proud of ourselves for not using them again, right?
Yeah, it's kind of absurd.
And what has happened too, then, I think, is that not using these things has become an excuse to produce something that's really sometimes unpalatable, but it's biodynamic, or we didn't add anything to it, so it's better for you. I'm like, yeah, but I want to enjoy it, and it should be enjoyable.
Great.
Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah. I think we're on the same page there, Paul.
We're at 50 minutes, so I'm going to wrap this up. But I do have something fun for you, since you're, you studied French, and this is a book from. It's a French book, actually, but it's the English translation is called "Wine is the Best Medicine." This is Dr. Murray. He was an MD in France in the 70s, also a homeopathic doctor. And he has produced this book around human maladies, things like allergies, anemia, bronchitis, diarrhea, fever, gout, and a French wine that would help with the symptoms, if not cure this particular problem. Now, this is much like the MW exam. You're going to get, you may have a 33% chance of getting it right because I'm only going to give you 3 choices. However, what's fascinating is, like, why did you choose that? And I'll read to you after you answer the question what Dr. Murray determined as the reason. So let's just say you have a fever. Would you have and there's also a dosage to this, which we'll get to the second part of the question, a young Beaujolais, a dry champagne, or a Grave to help with your fever. Young Beaujolais, dry champagne, or Grave.
Well, since it was Beaujolais Nouveau Day yesterday,
That's right.
and we're recording this, I'm going to go with a young Beaujolais. Why? By the way, am I allowed to tell my personal trainer about this book? Because
Yes.
he's trying to tell me to drink less wine, and it seems like this is a good.
I've found 2 or 3 copies on eBay.
Excellent. Yeah. I'll gift it to her for the next, for Christmas. So, young Beaujolais, I suppose, uplifting, fresh, vibrant, get you out of the illness slump. Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry. And
No?
like most, really, it's very funny. It's silly. Really, only 33% of the time it gets it right. Just the pure odds of this. It's actually dry champagne. And Dr. Murray says why here. You said some pieces were right, like lack of energy or to bring your energy up. But because these wines contain, among other things, 2 important elements for a feverish person: phosphorus, which is eminently stimulating. And so you had that part right. I have to give you credit for that.
Just the wrong wine.
MW. And sulfur in its sulfate of potassium form, whose detoxifying action on the body has been established. All right. You get a chance of redemption, and that is how much champagne should you drink a day?
Well, it's got to be a bottle, right?
Well, you and Mr. Tétanger would appreciate that. Yes, it's a bottle. And look, I made the huge mistake of turning my sound engineer, who was my son-in-law for a year, onto properly made champagne, and now it's costing me a fortune to keep stocked at the house. So
not a cheap date anymore.
No. Been a fascinating conversation. I hope I can do it again.
Oh, that would be great. Paul, it's just wonderful to meet you and have all these lovely chats, share these thoughts.
As these things, as this industry moves on and I get to spend more time doing it, I like to hear what's going on, and it still changes quite a bit. And I think we need to be cognizant of that and to help people understand what we see and feel in this industry.
Yeah, agreed.
Thank you again, and cheers.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you for listening to Wine Talks with Paul Kalamkarian. Don't forget to subscribe, because there's more great interviews on their way. And folks, have a great time out there in the wine world. Cheers.